All right, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into Ukraine from a perspective you might not have heard before.
Yeah, it's a perspective that really makes you think about, who's pulling the strings and who benefits from this whole situation.
Exactly. And one of the first things that really caught my eye was this idea of volleyballness.
Volleyballness.
Yeah, or oko in Ukrainian.
Oh, wow.
And it's this term that's, it's being used sarcastically to describe how Ukrainians are portrayed as just sort of passively accepting whatever's happening to them, even if it's harmful.
Yeah, like they just take it, no matter what. And it's a pretty provocative way to frame the Ukrainian response to the conflict, don't you think? Especially when you look at the mobilization efforts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
like we see stories of people doing everything they can to avoid being conscripted, hiding, disguising themselves, even being dragged into vehicles.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. It really makes you question this whole volleyballness narrative,
Yeah, it does. Because it doesn't line up with what we're seeing on the ground.
Right.
But then there's this whole other layer with Zelensky's plan for victory and its focus on Ukraine's natural resources.
That's where things get really interesting.
So tell me about that. What's the story there?
Well, apparently there was this whole secret plan to basically offer up these resources to Western partners in exchange for investment.
I see.
And there's one resource in particular that they really focus on: lithium.
Lithium.
Yeah.
As in the stuff used in electric vehicle batteries.
Exactly. The stuff everyone's going crazy for.
So Ukraine has a lot of it.
Apparently so. But here's the irony. The Donbas region, the one that's always portrayed as this subsidized area draining Ukraine's resources.
Right.
Well, it turns out it's sitting on a gold mine of valuable resources, primarily coal.
So not a burden, after all.
Not at all. It's almost as if this whole narrative surrounding the Donbas was deliberately misleading to hide its true value in this conflict.
Wow. So instead of being a liability, it might actually be one of the most valuable parts of Ukraine.
That's the argument. And there's more.
Oh.
Ukraine also has a significant amount of iron ore.
Okay.
But the thing is, iron ore is pretty abundant in other parts of the world without all the geopolitical baggage. So it makes you wonder, why so much focus on Ukraine's resources?
Right. It's interesting. You mentioned that Zelensky's plan was to leverage these resources for support. But why all the secrecy? Why not just be transparent about it?
Well, the argument is that this plan was carefully crafted to appeal to Trump and his administration.
No.
It was no secret that securing resources and countering China were high on their agenda.
Sure.
So by offering up these resources, Zelensky was essentially tapping into Trump's drill, baby, drill mindset.
Playing to his interests.
Exactly, and hoping to secure more military aid and maybe even direct U.S. intervention in the conflict.
So it was a calculated move to get Trump on board, using resources as leverage.
Right.
Did it work?
Well, not quite as planned. It seems Trump wasn't really interested in getting directly involved. He saw it as a European problem, He preferred to focus on resources closer to home, especially in the Arctic region.
Because of Russia.
Exactly.
Right.
So even with all these valuable resources on offer, Trump wasn't biting.
That's interesting. But what about the Ukrainian people? How did they react to this plan to essentially give away control of their country's resources?
That's a crucial point here. Because despite all the talk about fighting for independence, there doesn't seem to have been any public outcry against this proposal.
Really?
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to, say, Latin American countries that fought tooth and nail for independence, specifically to avoid becoming resource colonies for foreign powers.
That's a really good point. Yeah. It makes you think about how differently independence can be defined and fought for.
It does.
So where does Zelensky fit into all of this? What role does he play in this narrative?
Well, he's being portrayed as a comprador.
A comprador?
Yeah, it's a term used to describe someone who puts foreign investments and interests ahead of the needs of their own people.
That's a pretty heavy label.
It is. And it ties back to the alleged mistreatment of Ukrainian men during mobilization.
All right. So it feeds into this image of a leader willing to sacrifice his people for personal gain.
Exactly.
So we have this plan to exchange resources for support, and Zelensky's at the center of it all. But did anything actually come of it? Was there a real exchange?
Well, there's this really interesting statement from Trump where he talks about wanting guarantees for American investments in Ukraine.
Okay.
He specifically mentions rare earth metals in exchange for weapons.
Interesting.
And get this, Kiev was apparently ready to provide those guarantees.
Hold on. So Zelenskyy was willing to just hand over control of Ukraine's resources.
Right.
What about Europe? Weren't they supposed to be contributing too?
You're right. Europe was expected to chip in, but they were having some financial difficulties.
I see.
And this really highlights the power dynamics at play here.
How so?
Well, the U.S. was calling the shots, and Zelenskyy seemed all too happy to go along with it.
In Europe?
They were kind of sidelined.
Wow. So Zelenskyy was basically making deals about Ukraine's future without their involvement.
It seems that way. And what makes it even more unsettling is that while this was all going on, Trump was talking about progress and peace talks. But guess what? Ukraine was completely excluded from those discussions.
Seriously. So their fate was being decided without them.
It appears so, which raises some serious questions about their agency in all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the Trump administration either.
You're right. It seems like there's been a shift in rhetoric with the current administration as well. Less talk about democratic values and more about, pragmatic transactions.
So less about fighting for Ukraine's freedom and more about striking deals and getting their hands on those resources.
It seems to be the direction things are heading. It's almost like, imagine if you had to sell your house to pay for a car repair.
Okay.
But instead of selling the house, you offered up your wife. That's the kind of analogy being used to describe Zelensky's actions here. He's offering up something that doesn't belong to him, making deals about Ukraine's future without their consent.
That's a pretty powerful analogy. It definitely gets the point across.
It does. And what's even more striking is the lack of information about what exactly Zelenskyy promised Trump. I mean, imagine the public reaction if something like this had happened under Yanukovych.
Right. It would have been huge.
Exactly. But with Zelenskyy, it's like it's flying under the radar.
So he's potentially giving away all of Ukraine's resources and no one's really making a fuss.
Yeah.
This whole volleyballness idea comes to mind again.
It's definitely a recurring theme in this perspective. The argument is that the Ukrainian people are, for whatever reason, not reacting to this situation with the outrage you might expect. But there's another layer to consider here. What if Trump was playing Zelenskyy all along?
What do you mean?
Some people argue that Trump, being the businessman that he is, might have seen right through Zelensky's plan and realized that the resources were either exaggerated or impossible to get to. So by pretending to go along with the deal, he would essentially be stringing Zelenskyy along.
Knowing that Ukraine couldn't actually deliver on those promises.
Exactly. What a power move that would be.
It would leave Ukraine in a really vulnerable position.
It would. And then there's the question of what would be left for Ukraine in that scenario.
Right. What would they have left to give?
They'd have to give up everything, their soil, their worms, everything. But then out of nowhere comes this unexpected voice, Olaf Scholz.
The German chancellor?
The one and only criticizing the U.S. for its self-serving approach.
Really? What's he saying?
He's arguing that Ukraine is going to need its resources to rebuild after the war.
So he's actually speaking up for Ukraine.
It seems that way, which is pretty surprising coming from someone who's often perceived as a weaker leader.
It is, especially when you contrast it with Zelensky's silence on the issue.
It's a really interesting twist. Yeah, it really makes you think, why is Scholz the one speaking up for the Ukrainian people?
Yeah, and why isn't Zelenskyy saying anything about it? It's strange.
Well, it's possible that Scholz is concerned because it seems like Zelensky's chosen to prioritize the U.S. over Europe when it comes to sharing these resources.
So instead of getting support from multiple places, he's putting all his eggs in one basket.
That's what it looks like. Remember, initially, there was this idea that the resources would be shared with European partners, too.
Right.
But now it seems like Zelensky's decided to give it all to the U.S.
So Europe's getting pushed aside.
Pretty much. And it really shows you the power dynamics at work here.
In what way?
Well, even though Europe might have its doubts, it doesn't seem to have the same influence over Zelensky's decisions as the U.S. does.
I see.
Like the U.S. can just shut down any objections from Europe, which is completely different to how Russia operates. They're not afraid to stand their ground on things like oil prices.
Right. So we have the U.S. potentially taking advantage of the situation, Europe being sidelined, and Zelenskyy making these decisions about Ukraine's resources without any real transparency or public debate.
Yeah, it's a pretty messy situation.
So where does that leave Ukraine? What does their future look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This perspective we're looking at doesn't paint a very hopeful picture.
How so?
They're saying that Ukraine, after going through this devastating war, will end up depleted of its resources, basically becoming a resource colony for the U.S., with its people forced to work as miners under Zelensky's rule.
That's a pretty grim outlook.
It is. There's no denying that. This whole conversation has been full of twists and turns, We started with this idea of volleyballness, and we've ended up in this tangled web of geopolitics, resource exploitation, and questions about what independence really means.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's important to remember that this is just one perspective on the situation. There are many others out there.
Right. Of course.
But what makes this perspective so interesting is how it makes you question the motives and actions of those in power, both within Ukraine and on the international stage.
It definitely raises some tough questions. Like when you mentioned earlier that Trump might have been trolling Zelenskyy. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. So the argument is that Trump, being the shrewd businessman that he is, might have seen right through Zelensky's plan and realized that those resources were either overblown or completely out of reach. So by going along with the deal, he'd be stringing Zelenskyy along, knowing full well that Ukraine couldn't actually deliver.
So it's a way of asserting dominance, showing that the U.S. holds all the cards.
Exactly. It would put Ukraine in a really vulnerable position. They'd be committed to something they couldn't actually fulfill.
You also used the term comprador to describe Zelenskyy earlier. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Of course, a comprador is a term that comes from post-colonial studies. It usually refers to a local elite who acts as a middleman for foreign powers, putting those foreign interests ahead of their own people's needs.
Right.
Now, in this case, it's being used to suggest that Zelensky's actions are benefiting the U.S. and its economic interests more than they're benefiting the people of Ukraine.
It's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. But it does seem to fit with this narrative of resource exploitation and lack of transparency in decision-making.
But you also said there wasn't any public outcry against Zelensky's alleged plan. Why do you think that is?
That's a complicated question. There's no easy answer. Some people might say it's because of the war, the need for unity when you're facing a common enemy.
Right.
Others might say it's because people are afraid to speak out against those in power during such a volatile time.
I can see that.
And of course, there's always the possibility that information is being controlled and that dissenting voices are being silenced.
It's hard to know what's really going on.
It is. But this lack of public outcry is a big part of this whole volleyballness idea, isn't it?
It is. It feeds in this image of Ukrainians as passive, just accepting whatever happens to them.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how much agency people really have, especially during times of conflict.
This perspective is pretty bleak when it comes to Ukraine's future. But you did mention earlier that it's just one perspective among many. Are there other ways of looking at this situation, especially when it comes to Ukraine's resources?
Absolutely. One could argue that using resources to get support, even if it's done secretly, could be a smart move for a country in a desperate situation.
It's a matter of survival.
Right. Ukraine's facing an existential threat, and they need all the help they can get.
So it's a pragmatic approach, even if it involves compromises and risks.
Exactly. And you could also argue that if done properly, developing Ukraine's resource sector could actually benefit their economy in the long run, creating jobs and opportunities for people. So it's about finding a balance between their immediate needs and long-term sustainability, between getting support and maintaining their sovereignty.
Exactly.
It's a delicate balancing act,
Yeah.
and there are no easy answers. Each perspective has its own considerations, its own potential benefits and risks.
That's true. It's important to remember that these complex situations rarely have simple solutions.
Right. There are always trade-offs, unintended consequences, and a need for careful thought and critical analysis.
It's a reminder that we need to engage with these different perspectives,
Great.
weigh the arguments, challenge our assumptions, and ultimately come to our own conclusions about the best way forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah.
What can we as individuals even do with this information?
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to feel powerless when you're looking at these global power struggles and these complicated webs of political and economic interests. But I think the first step is awareness. Just by understanding these issues, by seeing through these carefully constructed narratives, we're already starting to take back some of that power,
So knowledge is power.
In a way, yes. But it's not just about passively taking in information. It's about using that knowledge to guide our actions, to hold those in power accountable, to demand transparency and ethical decision-making.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not about feeling helpless. It's about taking that awareness and turning it into action.
Yeah.
But what does that action look like? What can we actually do?
Well, it can take many forms. It could be supporting organizations that are working for peace and justice in Ukraine, or advocating for policies that promote responsible resource management.
Okay.
It could be raising awareness in our own communities, having these difficult conversations, challenging people who are spreading harmful narratives.
So it's about becoming more conscious consumers of information, more active citizens, and more vocal advocates for a just and equitable world.
Exactly. It's about understanding that even though these issues might seem far away or too complicated, they actually affect all of us. What happens in one part of the world has a ripple effect on the whole,
It's a reminder that we're not just watching this unfold. We're active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
And that's a powerful realization. It means that even small actions can have a ripple effect and contribute to a larger movement for positive change.
This deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We started with this idea of volleyballness and ended up exploring these complex geopolitical dynamics, the role of resources in conflict, and the nature of power and control.
It has been quite a journey, hasn't it? And we've only just scratched the surface. There's always more to learn, more to uncover, more to question.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a never-ending journey of discovery, of challenging ourselves and the world around us.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There are so many people out there who are seeking truth, demanding justice, and working towards a better future.
That's inspiring. So if you had to pick one thing, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I want them to leave with a renewed sense of agency, a realization that their voices matter and that their actions can actually make a difference.
That's a powerful message. And I hope our listeners will join us in continuing to explore these important issues, to keep asking questions, and to never stop seeking the truth. Because as we've learned today, the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered.
And the more we uncover, the more empowered we become to create the world we want to see.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear.